What if one simple moment, a glass of water, a meal placed on a tray, became the mirror of how people truly see you? Picture yourself sitting in first class. Ticket confirmed, seat assigned. Others around you are offered champagne and fine meals with warm smiles. And then, when it's your turn, the flight attendant looks down and says, "Sorry, those are only for first-class passengers." Would you brush it off, convincing yourself it was a mistake? Or would you feel that familiar sting, the reminder that no matter your success, the world sometimes refuses to see your worth? This isn't a story about food. It's about dignity, about the quiet choices that define whether we endure or stand tall. And on this flight, three brothers, a set of black CEOs who built an empire from nothing, were forced to make that choice. The attendants had no idea who was sitting before them, or how the entire airline would be transformed by what happened next. If it were you, how would you respond? Would you stay silent, or would you rise? Join us on this journey. And before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe to keep these powerful stories alive. The hum of the cabin air was steady, the kind of background sound most travelers stop noticing after a few minutes. The smell of warm bread floated through first class, mingling with the faint perfume of expensive cologne and the sterile tang of recycled air. A flight attendant in a crisp navy uniform glided down the aisle, balancing a tray of plated meals. She smiled warmly at a white couple near the window, describing the wine pairings like a seasoned sommelier. But when she reached row 2, her expression shifted. Her smile evaporated. Her voice grew colder. "I'm sorry," she said firmly, setting down nothing but 3 plastic cups of water. "These meals are reserved for our first-class passengers only." For a moment, the 3 men seated side by side simply stared at her. Adrian Ellis, the eldest of the Ellis triplets, rested his hands on his knees, his face unreadable. Years of boardroom battles had taught him the power of silence. Beside him, Damian Ellis leaned back in his seat, his lips curling into a tight, disbelieving smile. And Julian Ellis, the youngest, blinked hard as though he hadn't heard correctly. They were dressed neatly, but not extravagantly polished leather shoes, pressed shirts, business casual jackets. Nothing screamed wealthy or powerful. And that was by design. This trip was meant to be quiet, anonymous, a chance to experience their airline as ordinary customers. But now, with one careless sentence, the entire cabin had gone still. The woman's name tag read Claire Monroe. She kept her posture straight, her eyes darting quickly over their dark skin, their identical faces, their calm but piercing gazes. She adjusted her uniform scarf as though bracing herself. Damien broke the silence first. His voice was smooth, tinged with a sharp edge. "Excuse me? Did I hear you correctly?" Claire tightened her jaw. "We don't have enough premium meals for everyone." "I assumed." "Well, I thought you gentlemen might be waiting for the economy service." Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman paused mid-bite, his fork frozen, 2 rows ahead. An elderly woman glanced over her shoulder, her brow furrowed. The air thickened, heavy with the unspoken. Julian inhaled deeply. He had trained himself to recognize this moment, the sting of dismissal wrapped in polite tones. It wasn't the first time. Not by a long shot. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "We are first-class passengers. Our tickets say so." Adrian leaned forward, his voice calm, measured. "Ma'am, would you please check again? Our boarding passes clearly indicate first class. We paid for the same service as everyone else here." Claire hesitated, her cheeks flushing slightly, but instead of apologizing, She doubled down. I'll need to see your tickets again. Adrian's eyes flickered to his brother's. A wordless exchange passed between them, honed from years of navigating the world together. This wasn't just about food. This was about something older, deeper. Damien exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. You didn't ask anyone else to prove they belonged here. The businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The silence in the cabin became its own kind of pressure. Claire stood her ground, chin lifted. Sir, I'm only following procedures. Procedures, Adrian asked, his tone polite but edged with steel. Or assumptions. That single word assumptions hung in the air like a challenge. The triplets had grown up hearing those assumptions in different forms. When they were 12, a store clerk accused them of stealing candy they hadn't touched. When they launched their first startup, investors assumed their success was luck or a trend. Even after they built Ellis & Co., a billion-dollar tech empire, they were still mistaken for chauffeurs, interns, anything but the men in charge. Now, on this flight on their own airline, they were being told they didn't belong in the very seats they had purchased. Julian's fist curled in his lap. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. But he forced himself to stay composed. His EMT training had taught him that steady hands could mean the difference between life and death. The same principle applied here. Steady voices could mean the difference between dignity preserved or dignity erased. Damien leaned forward, his voice low but cutting. Let me ask you something. Claire, what exactly about us made you think we weren't first class? Her eyes flicked downward, then sideways, avoiding his gaze. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The hush spread wider now. More passengers turned their heads. Phones slipped discreetly out of pockets. A few passengers pressed record. Adrian finally spoke again, his tone so calm it carried authority without effort. We will not raise our voices. We will not cause a scene. But we will not be dismissed. Not today. Claire's lips tightened. She scribbled something quickly on her notepad, then walked briskly toward the galley without another word. The triplets sat back, the tension hanging thick between them. Damien muttered under his breath, Unbelievable. After everything we've built, after everything we've overcome. Adrian cut him off gently. Document it. Every detail. Julian nodded, pulling out his tablet. His fingers moved quickly, typing denied meals, asked to show tickets again, other passengers watching. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. He remembered their father's words. Never confuse silence with weakness. Sometimes silence is the strongest stance of all. When he opened them again, his gaze was sharp. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was calculating. This was only the beginning. The quiet in the cabin lingered long after Claire Monroe disappeared into the galley. The Ellis brothers didn't speak for several minutes, but each of them carried the same thought in his chest. This wasn't new. It wasn't surprising. It was exhausting. Yet as the hum of the engines filled the silence, memories surfaced, weaving into the present moment. Adrian let his gaze drift toward the oval window. Below, the ground was a blur of clouds and fading city lights. But in his mind, he was back in Detroit, standing in a cramped two-bedroom home, where the smell of motor oil clung to his father's jacket, and the sound of their mother's voice carried steady encouragement after long night shifts at the hospital. Their father, Leonard Ellis, was a mechanic who worked with grease-stained hands until his knuckles cracked. Their mother, Diane Ellis, was a nurse who juggled double shifts, sometimes coming home at dawn with tired eyes but a warm smile. They didn't have much money, but they had dignity. That dignity was the Ellis family currency, more valuable than gold. Adrian remembered one Saturday when he and his brothers, then barely 10 years old, were playing basketball at the local court. A group of older boys mocked them, calling them names too sharp to forget, insisting they didn't belong in the neighborhood because their shoes were cheap knockoffs. Leonard had walked over, still in his grease-streaked coveralls, and gathered his boys close. "Never let anyone tell you what you're worth based on what you're wearing," he said. "Value comes from here." He tapped Adrian's chest, from the heart, from how you carry yourself. That lesson had burned into Adrian's mind like a brand. He carried it still, sitting now in first class, his ticket questioned, his meal denied. He heard his father's voice as clearly as if Leonard were still alive. Next to him, Damien shifted, pulling out his phone, his reflection visible in the darkened screen. He thought of their teenage years, when his charm and easy laugh often masked how much the world's small cuts stung him. Damien had always been the one to speak up, to argue back when a teacher assumed he hadn't done his homework, or when a store clerk followed them through the aisles. But for every joke he cracked, every smooth line he delivered, he carried the quiet ache of knowing his words were dismissed until proven otherwise. He recalled the night they launched their first venture building, simple websites for local businesses. He had gone door to door with Malcolm No, with Adrian and Julian trying to convince store owners to give them a chance. More than once, he'd seen shopkeepers look at the 3 identical black boys and smirk, as though their ambition was laughable. "Come back when you're older," they'd say, or "when you're serious." And every time, Damien's smile stayed, but inside, the fire grew hotter. Julian, the youngest, leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the muscles in his jaw tight. He wasn't as quick with words as Damien, nor as controlled as Adrian. He was the one who preferred data, patterns, logic. Yet logic never seemed to protect them from bias. In college at MIT, he'd been mistaken for a janitor more times than he could count. "Could you clean up this lab?" someone once asked as he carried his textbooks. Even when he spoke, his knowledge challenged, as though brilliance couldn't belong to a face like his. But Julian's memory tonight wasn't of labs or lectures. It was of a night during their sophomore year, when their mother collapsed from exhaustion. He had ridden in the ambulance with her, watching the paramedics' swift hands. That was the night he decided to train in emergency medical response. If help is needed, I want to be the one who knows what to do. He told his brothers. He kept his EMT certification even now, long after success made it unnecessary. Julian's hand hovered near his tablet, where he had typed up Claire's behavior word for word. He understood evidence. Evidence had always been their shield. "Document it," Adrian had said, and Julian did, because the world didn't listen to outrage, but it couldn't ignore proof. The triplets' lives had not been built on comfort. They had built their empire, Ellis & Co., from late nights coding in a borrowed basement, from scraping together rent, from rejection letters that piled up like snowdrifts. Investors doubted them. Competitors ridiculed them. Headlines questioned whether 3 young black men could possibly reshape the future of logistics. But they did. They had turned Ellis & Co. into a multi-billion-dollar powerhouse, their algorithms reshaping supply chains across industries, saving corporations billions in wasted costs. And now, here they sat, quiet in first class, refused a meal as if they were imposters. Damien finally broke the silence. He leaned closer to his brothers, his voice low but tight with frustration. "I swear, if Dad were here," Adrian cut him off softly. Dad would tell us to keep our heads high, to fight, but not with anger, to fight with action, Julian added, his voice thoughtful, to fight with evidence. The three of them exchanged glances, identical faces reflecting identical resolve. Across the aisle, the elderly woman who had been watching earlier, her name, as they would soon learn, was Martha Jennings, gave them a sympathetic nod. She had seen enough to understand what was happening. She didn't speak yet, but her eyes carried both sorrow and recognition. Adrian breathed deeply, his chest rising and falling as he calmed himself. He had always known leadership was not about comfort. It was about clarity, about choosing the right moment to act. And this moment, he felt, was sharpening into something larger than a personal slight. He pulled out his notebook, the same leather-bound one he always carried, and scribbled a few words. Test a culture. Flight 482. Observe. Document. Respond. Damien shook his head, muttering, "It's insane. We own part of this airline." And still, "Yes," Adrian interrupted gently, "and that's exactly why we're here. To see it with our own eyes. To know the truth, not reports, not filtered memos, the truth." Julian set his tablet on his lap, staring at the blank screensaver. "And the truth is ugly. Ugly, yes," Adrian replied, "but fixable." The plane jolted slightly, turbulence rocking them. Passengers gasped, then settled again as the aircraft smoothed out. To Adrian, it felt symbolic, the ride rough, but steadying. His gaze fell once more on the dark window, the faint reflection of his own face staring back. He thought of their mother's quiet resilience, of his father's calloused hands, of the countless battles fought and endured. This was not just about dinner service. It was about dignity. And dignity, once denied, had to be reclaimed. As Claire's footsteps echoed back toward their row, the brothers straightened in unison. They had not spoken aloud, but the decision was already made. Whatever unfolded next, they would meet it together, as they always had. The plane leveled into its cruising altitude, but the tension in row 2 did not ease. Claire Monroe had returned with forced composure, delivering trays to other passengers, pointedly skipping the Ellis brothers as though they were invisible. Every deliberate step of her polished shoes against the aisle carpet felt like an echo of judgment. Yet Adrian, Damien, and Julian sat still, their silence a deliberate form of resistance. It hadn't begun in the cabin. The memory of the airport lingered, raw and irritating. At check-in, the clerk had scrutinized their boarding passes longer than necessary, tilting her head as if the tickets might morph into counterfeits under her stare. "First class," she had asked, her tone half disbelief, half accusation. Adrian had responded politely, placing his driver's license and corporate card on the counter. Yet her eyes had darted to the security officer behind her before reluctantly printing their passes. At the boarding gate, the sting sharpened. A man in a navy blazer breezed past, scanning his phone without so much as slowing down. Seconds later, the Triplet stepped forward, and the gate agent stopped them with a raised hand. "IDs again, please." His eyes had scanned their faces, the three identical features, as if suspicious by nature. Other passengers shifted impatiently behind them, whispering, sighing, but the agent insisted. It wasn't until Damien leaned close, voice calm but firm, that the man relented, his jaw tight as he waved them through. That was before the meal denial, before Claire's icy remark. By the time they buckled their seatbelts, the message was clear no matter the price of the ticket. Some still saw them as unworthy travelers in spaces marked premium. Julian replayed the gate incident in his mind. each detail etched sharply. He tapped notes on his tablet under the heading Boarding Experience. The more he wrote, the more his pulse steadied. Data was his armor. Every instance documented, every slight transformed into evidence, each piece a stone in the wall of truth they would eventually reveal. Damien shifted, his fingers drumming against the armrest. His smile was faint but bitter. He wanted to stand up, to challenge Claire in front of everyone, to demand respect in a voice no one could ignore. But he glanced at Adrian, whose calm expression reminded him of restraint. Their eldest brother's silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy, and Damien knew, if he erupted now, they would be labeled aggressive, confirming the very stereotype they fought against. From 2 rows ahead, the elderly passenger, Martha Jennings, peeked again. Her eyes softened with empathy as she caught Damien's glance. She didn't speak, but the faint nod she gave was enough someone else had noticed. Witnesses mattered. Adrian broke the silence finally, leaning toward his brothers so only they could hear. We knew this could happen. That's why we chose to fly without an entourage. No assistants, no press, no announcements, just us. We needed to see it unfiltered. His voice was steady, but underneath it lay a thread of frustration he rarely let slip. Julian nodded, his brows furrowed. And what we're seeing is exactly what we feared. Damien scoffed softly. Feared no. Jules. Expected? He lowered his voice, his gaze flicking to Claire as she passed again. The question is, how far will they go? The intercom chimed overhead. The voice of the captain, Roger Harlow, filled the cabin, calm and authoritative. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 36,000 feet. Please sit back and enjoy the service from our crew. We're honored to have you aboard Sky America Flight 482. Adrian exchanged a knowing look with his brothers. Honored, he murmured, tasting the irony of the word. Moments later, Claire returned, this time with a notepad in hand. She stopped at their row. Her expression sharpened into professional neutrality. Gentlemen, she said crisply, the captain has been informed of a situation. We'd like to remind you that disruptive behavior will not be tolerated in the cabin. Damien's head snapped up. Disruptive. His voice rose, though still under control. Asking for the meal we paid for is disruptive. Claire did not flinch. Sir, passengers have reported discomfort. We must maintain a safe environment. The businessman across the aisle, who had been watching from the start, leaned forward. That's not true, he interjected firmly. These men haven't raised their voices. You skipped them, and I saw it. Claire ignored him, her gaze fixed on the triplets. Adrian remained calm, though a flicker of fire burned in his chest. Claire, he said evenly, the only discomfort here is the discomfort of being confronted with your own assumptions. We have not been disruptive. We have not broken a rule. But I assure you, we will not disappear quietly. Julian, still typing, captured every word. His notes grew longer by the minute. The businessman sat back, muttering audibly. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. A few passengers nodded in agreement. Small murmurs spread through the cabin. The story was no longer contained to row 2. It was growing, rippling outward like circles in water. Claire stiffened, scribbling furiously on her notepad. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked briskly to the galley again. Damien let out a low whistle. Unbelievable! Now we're disruptive. He tilted his head toward Adrian. You know where this is going. Right, Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. Yes, and we'll be ready. The quiet returned, heavy but purposeful. For the Ellis brothers, this was not just a slight against their dignity. It was confirmation of a truth they had long suspected: prejudice was embedded not only in individuals, but in the very systems they now partially owned. This was why they had chosen to fly anonymously, not to enjoy luxury, but to see reality without filters. And reality, as it often did, was laying itself bare. Dinner service resumed in the cabin as though nothing had happened. Trays of salmon, beef tenderloin, and fresh salads were delivered with precision to passengers in neatly pressed suits and flowing dresses. Wine glasses clinked softly. Laughter bubbled up here and there, trying to fill the uneasy silence that still lingered around row 2. For Adrian, the sound of forks against porcelain plates was sharper than the engines outside. Each clink was a reminder of what had been withheld, of the unspoken line that Claire Monroe had drawn between the Ellis brothers and everyone else. He watched as a glass of Pinot Noir was poured for the businessman across the aisle, the ruby liquid catching the overhead light. When Claire passed their row again, she didn't meet their eyes. She carried on as though the three men simply weren't there. Damien leaned closer to his brothers, lowering his voice. "You notice how she serves everyone with that little smile. Everyone except us." His tone carried both amusement and anger, like he couldn't decide whether to laugh or explode. Julian answered without looking up from his tablet. "Documented. Time-stamped. Meal service skipped again at 8:45 p.m. His stylus moved swiftly, precise as a scalpel. He added, "She's not careless. This is deliberate." Adrian clasped his hands in his lap, his posture steady, though his mind was anything but still. Every detail pressed against his thoughts, the narrowed eyes a check-in, the ID check at the gate. Claire's words echoing like a verdict not for you. He wanted to believe this was just one crew member's bias, one moment of ignorance, but his instincts told him otherwise. Prejudice rarely lived in isolation. It spread quietly through systems, unspoken yet persistent, until someone dragged it into the light. From the row ahead, Martha Jennings shifted in her seat. She looked back at the brothers once more, her lined face soft with concern. When her eyes met Adrian's, she gave a faint nod again. It was a small gesture, but powerful in its way. She had seen it all. She was carrying their truth with her. Damien sighed heavily. "You ever get tired of it, Aid? Of being tested, over and over, no matter how far we've climbed?" Adrian turned his gaze from the window. "Every day," he said quietly. "But tired doesn't mean done." Julian tapped his tablet, saving his notes, then set it aside. He folded his hands together, staring down at the tray table in front of him, empty except for the untouched cup of water. His voice was low, steady. "It feels like Dad's back on the basketball court. Remember, being told we didn't belong on the court with the better shoes. Only now the court is 36,000 feet in the air, and the stakes are higher." Damien let out a hollow laugh. "And the referees wear Navy uniforms." The businessman across the aisle caught fragments of their words. He leaned slightly toward them, lowering his voice. "For what it's worth, gentlemen, I saw everything. She skipped you intentionally. If this goes any further, you'll have my statement." Adrian inclined his head in quiet gratitude. "Thank you. Sometimes the simplest act of truth makes all the difference." The man smiled faintly, then returned to his meal. Claire returned yet again, her tray empty now, her notepad tucked under her arm. Her eyes flicked to the triplets, but didn't linger. She moved swiftly past them, delivering hot towels to another row, chatting softly with a couple celebrating their anniversary. Her laughter rang false, almost too bright, but no one else seemed to notice. Julian's eyes followed her. "She's documenting us, too," he murmured. "Every glance at that notepad, every scribble. It's not just service notes. She's building a case." Adrian nodded slowly, "which means she intends to escalate. The question is whether the captain will back her." Damien exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Of course he will. Authority protects its own." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Unless someone holds a mirror up to the truth." The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew prepared for the overnight portion of the flight. Passengers pulled blankets around their shoulders, reclined their seats, and closed their eyes. The hum of the engines grew louder in the hush. But for the Ellis brothers, rest was impossible. Adrian leaned back, his thoughts racing. He thought of the countless times they had been mistaken for less than they were, the ways success had not insulated them from suspicion. He thought of their employees, thousands of them, who looked to the Ellis brothers as proof that progress was possible. If the world saw their dignity stripped so casually, what message did that send? Julian closed his eyes, pressing his thumb and forefinger against his temples. He remembered the paramedic's hands on his mother's chest the night she collapsed, the urgency of acting in time. That night had taught him that inaction could cost lives, and though this wasn't a matter of life or death, at least not yet in action, here still carried its own weight. Damien shifted restlessly. "I hate this part," he whispered. "What part?" Adrian asked. "The waiting. Sitting here, pretending we're comfortable, while every second they're building their story. One wrong word from us, and they'll call it disruption. And then we're the villains." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Then we give them nothing. Not one raised voice, not one sharp gesture. We hold the line, and when the moment comes, we'll show them exactly who we are." Julian opened his eyes. "Steady now, and we'll have the evidence to prove it, from the galley." Claire's laughter floated back again, forced and hollow. The divide in first class was no longer invisible. It had become the rhythm of the flight warmth for some, cold dismissal for others. But beneath the surface, something else was building, an undercurrent of awareness among the passengers. A quiet recognition that fairness was being tested right before their eyes. The Ellis brothers sat together, silent but unyielding, waiting for the inevitable storm. The faint chime of the seatbelt sign switching off was quickly followed by the clatter of service carts rolling down the aisle. It was time for the formal dinner, the hallmark of first class, the service that many passengers paid thousands for. The rich aroma of seared beef tenderloin and grilled salmon filled the cabin, accompanied by the buttery scent of fresh rolls and the crisp fragrance of chilled champagne. Passengers straightened in their seats, pulling down their tray tables with anticipation. Adrian Ellis sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the cart as it moved closer. Damien's fingers tapped against his thigh in a restless rhythm. Julian's gaze was on Claire Monroe, who walked confidently behind the service cart as if nothing had transpired earlier. The brothers had already experienced enough subtle dismissal for one evening, but they knew this moment would either confirm their suspicions or perhaps, though unlikely, offer a chance at correction. Claire reached row 1, presenting dishes with the rehearsed charm of a professional. "Would you prefer the beef tenderloin with garlic mashed potatoes, or the salmon with asparagus and lemon butter?" she asked a businessman in a pinstripe suit. Her smile was warm, almost glowing, as she leaned slightly toward him. The man chuckled, choosing the salmon, and she placed the plate gently before him. His wine glass was refilled without him needing to ask. When she reached row 2, her expression hardened. She did not recite the options. She did not ask for their preference. Instead, she set down 3 small trays, each holding a cold turkey sandwich sealed in plastic wrap, accompanied by a packet of pretzels. "Here you go," she said flatly, as though speaking to strangers on a bus rather than first-class passengers. Damien's laugh came first, low and disbelieving. He picked up the sandwich, turning it over in his hands. "This is a joke." "Right." His tone was sharp, but his volume controlled. Passengers nearby turned their heads at the sound. Julian stared at his tray, then looked up at Claire. "Where are the meal options?" "We didn't receive any menu, and these aren't first-class offerings." His words were precise, deliberate, his voice even. Claire's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but we're limited tonight. We've had to prioritize meals for our premium passengers." The words landed like a hammer. Premium passengers, as though their tickets, their payments, their very presence did not qualify them. The businessman across the aisle lowered his fork mid-bite, his eyes widening. Martha Jennings shifted again in her seat, now openly frowning. Damien leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his tone sharp but steady. "So let me get this straight. Everyone else in this cabin is premium, but we, sitting in the same seats, with the same tickets," are not. Claire hesitated only for a second before replying. "We do what we can to accommodate everyone." "Sir, these are the meals we have available for you." Adrian's voice broke the silence, calm but filled with quiet authority. "Claire, we purchased first-class tickets. We are entitled to the same service as every other passenger here. To deny us equal service is not only unacceptable, it's discriminatory." The air grew heavier. A passenger in row 3 pulled out his phone, tilting it subtly toward the exchange. Another whispered to his spouse, their voices carrying just enough to suggest unease. Claire stiffened, clutching her notepad tighter. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to lower your tone. You're making other passengers uncomfortable." Damien let out a sharp breath, incredulous. "Uncomfortable. They're uncomfortable because they can see what's happening, because you've made it plain who you think belongs here and who doesn't." Julian, though his pulse was racing, remained deliberate. He lifted his tablet slightly, his voice calm. "Everything is being documented. Every word, every action. This isn't just about us. It's about accountability." Claire's eyes flashed with irritation, but she said nothing. She scribbled furiously on her notepad again, before turning to serve another row, leaving the brothers with their plastic-wrapped sandwiches. For a long moment, the 3 men sat in silence. The plastic trays in front of them seemed almost symbolic, a crude reminder of exclusion dressed up as practicality. Damien pushed his sandwich aside with a scoff. "We've built a billion-dollar company. Aid. We've bought into this airline. For God's sake. And still we're just 3 black men being told we don't belong." Adrian's eyes were steady, though his jaw was clenched. "That's why we're here. To see the truth with our own eyes. To know the culture we're dealing with." He paused, lowering his voice. "But tonight, the truth won't stay hidden. It's already spreading." Julian nodded toward the aisle, where he saw 2 passengers whispering and glancing at their phones. "People are recording. This won't stay in this cabin." Martha Jennings turned slightly, speaking for the first time. Her voice was gentle but firm. "You gentlemen don't deserve this. I've flown Sky America for years, and I've never seen anyone treated this way. You should know I'll speak up if needed. Adrian inclined his head with gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am. Your voice matters more than you realize." The businessman across the aisle chimed in, his tone louder, clearer. "It's disgraceful. This isn't service. It's discrimination. I'll be filing a complaint myself." Claire glanced back from the galley, her eyes narrowing, realizing the tide in the cabin was shifting. Yet instead of retreating, she stood taller, her notepad clutched like a shield. Adrian, Damien, and Julian sat together, shoulders squared, a silent wall of resolve. They would not eat the sandwiches. They would not be silenced. And though the night was far from over, they knew this moment the denial of a simple meal would echo far beyond the walls of the plane. The cabin had grown quieter after the dinner trays were cleared, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud that refused to pass. A handful of passengers reclined, attempting to rest, while others scrolled idly on their phones. Yet in row 2, the Ellis brothers sat upright, alert, the air around them charged. They knew the evening had not yet reached its peak. Claire Monroe reappeared with her notepad pressed tightly against her chest, her expression drawn into the tight-lipped smile of someone who believed she had regained control. She stopped at their row again, this time lowering her voice, but with an edge sharp enough to cut. "Gentlemen, I'll need to take your names for the captain's report." Damien raised an eyebrow. "The captain's report." He kept his tone light, mocking. But the irritation underneath was clear. "Funny. I don't recall anyone else here being asked to hand over their names for daring to request dinner." Claire's smile thinned. "You've been identified as disruptive. It's my responsibility to document passengers who cause concern." Julian shook his head slowly, his voice measured. "We haven't disrupted anything. We've asked for the service we purchased. We've documented calmly. The only disruption here is the way you've chosen to treat us differently." Adrian leaned forward, his presence steady but commanding. "Claire, you already know our names. Every flight manifest lists its passengers. What you want isn't identification, it's intimidation. But intimidation doesn't work on us." Claire stiffened. For a fleeting moment, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Yet she recovered quickly, pressing her notepad open as though the act alone gave her authority. "Then please confirm names, occupations, and the nature of your travel." Damien let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You really want to go down this road?" He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulling out a sleek black business card. The gold-embossed letters gleamed under the cabin light. He placed it gently on her notepad. "Damien Ellis," he said firmly, "co-founder and CEO of Ellis & Co." Julian followed, his hand calm as he slid an identical card onto the page. "Julian Ellis, co-founder, CTO." Adrian placed his card last, his gaze locked on Claire's. "Adrian Ellis, co-founder, chairman. And if you're curious about the nature of our travel, this flight is part of a personal audit of Sky America Airlines, an airline we co-own." The words struck the air like thunder. Passengers nearby shifted, whispering in disbelief. The businessman across the aisle sat back, eyebrows raised, a small smirk tugging at his lips. Martha Jennings leaned forward, eyes alight, as if silently cheering. Claire blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Her pen hovered above the page, but her hand trembled slightly. She glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Ethan Blake, the younger flight attendant, had frozen mid-step with a tray of water bottles. His eyes widened in recognition, and then in guilt. "I've seen them before," Ethan said softly, his voice carrying across the aisle despite his attempt at discretion. "They're on the cover of Fortune. Last year's tech innovators list. They own Ellis & Co., the logistics firm that just bought into Sky America. Gase rippled through the cabin. A woman in row 4 leaned forward, whispering to her husband. Someone 2 rows back lifted their phone higher, recording openly now. Claire's face flushed red. She snapped her notepad shut. Regardless of your positions, gentlemen, all passengers must adhere to the same code of conduct. Ownership does not grant exemption. Adrian's expression did not shift. His voice remained calm, almost gentle, yet unyielding. We're not asking for exemption. We're asking for fairness. And your response proves why this flight matters more than you realize. Tonight, every witness here has seen how bias poisons service, and they've also seen how truth can expose it. Damien leaned back, crossing his arms, his voice smooth but cutting. And you've just tried to write us up for being ourselves. That will look real good on the evening news, Julian added, his tone clinical. Time of escalation. 9:32 p.m. Documentation entered. Passengers witnessing. Recorded. His stylus tapped once against his tablet, each sound precise and deliberate. Claire's composure cracked for a moment. She turned swiftly, striding back toward the galley. Ethan lingered, his eyes darting nervously between the brothers and the front of the cabin. Finally, he gave them a small nod of acknowledgement before following her. The cabin buzzed with whispered conversations. Some passengers looked shocked, others intrigued. A man in row 5 muttered to his seatmate, "Can you imagine owners of the airline treated like that?" A woman nearby shook her head, adding, "It's no surprise. Happens all the time, you just don't usually see it happen to people with power." Damien exhaled slowly, leaning closer to his brothers. "Well, the mask is off now." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, and that means the captain will know soon enough. He'll have to choose back his crew, or acknowledge the truth." Julian spoke softly, almost to himself, and we already know which way authority usually leans. The intercom chimed. Captain Roger Harlow's voice filled the cabin, calm but laced with a subtle firmness. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been informed of a situation involving passengers in first class. I'd like to remind everyone to remain cooperative and respectful, so we can ensure a smooth flight." "Thank you." The implication was clear. The warning had been issued. Damien tilted his head back, letting out a dry laugh. There it is. Disruption. Non-compliance. The oldest tools in the book. Adrian's gaze hardened, though his voice remained calm. Then we give them nothing. Nothing they can twist. But when we land, the truth won't belong to them anymore. It will belong to us. Julian folded his hands in his lap, his expression composed but his pulse racing. And to every camera in this cabin. The businessman across the aisle leaned in slightly, his voice firm. "You've got witnesses. Don't worry. We're with you." Martha Jennings nodded, her silver hair catching the dim cabin light. "I'll speak the truth when the time comes." The Ellis brothers sat straighter in their seats, the air heavy with both tension and anticipation. They had revealed their names, their positions, their authority, yet instead of retreating, the crew had chosen to escalate. The game had shifted, and the storm was only beginning to gather. The hum of the engines was steady, but inside the cabin, tension pressed down like an invisible weight. Every passenger could feel it. Phones hovered discreetly in hands, recording quietly under tray tables, tucked into magazine pockets. The cabin had become a theater, and the Ellis brothers were both actors and unwilling protagonists. Adrian sat with his back straight, eyes fixed on the curtain that separated first class from the galley. He could hear muffled voices, Claire Monroe's sharp whispers and Kenneth Doyle's baritone responses. Their words weren't clear, but their tone told enough. They were planning, not apologizing. Damien leaned sideways, speaking low enough that only his brothers could hear. They're not backing down. You can feel it. They're setting the stage to paint us as the villains. Julian's stylus tapped lightly against his tablet, each note crisp and deliberate, which is why every second counts. Documentation is our shield, but the real power lies in their mistakes. They'll overreach. The curtain whipped open. Kenneth Doyle stepped into the aisle. His chest puffed like a man who'd convinced himself he was right. He scanned the brothers' row, his jaw set tight. "Gentlemen," he began loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I'll need to speak with you privately in the galley." Adrian's voice was calm, controlled. "No, we're comfortable right here. Whatever needs to be said can be said in front of the passengers. Transparency benefits everyone." Kenneth's jaw twitched. "This isn't a negotiation. The captain has instructed me to remove any disruptive passengers. Cooperate, or we'll be forced to land early." A murmur rippled through the cabin. The businessman across the aisle muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." Martha Jennings pressed her hand against her chest, her expression tight with anger. Damien leaned forward, his voice steady but edged with disbelief. "So let me get this straight. We buy first-class tickets. We sit quietly. We ask for the same meal everyone else gets, and now you're threatening to divert the flight." Kenneth crossed his arms. "You've been argumentative, disruptive, and disrespectful to the crew. That behavior jeopardizes the safety of the flight." Julian finally looked up, his tone clinical. "Safety. Let's review. Safety was jeopardized when meal service was withheld as a tool of humiliation. Safety was compromised when passengers were threatened with diversion for asking fair questions. And safety was endangered when your lead attendant tried to rewrite the narrative instead of de-escalating. Those are the facts." The volume in Kenneth's voice climbed. "Enough of this grandstanding. You think you're untouchable because you run a company. But in this cabin, I'm in charge. You'll follow orders, or you'll face consequences." Adrian's reply was almost a whisper, but it carried through the charged silence. "You're right about one thing, Kenneth. In this cabin, leadership matters, and you've just shown everyone here what kind of leader you are." Claire reemerged from the galley, standing shoulder to shoulder with Kenneth, her lips tight. Ethan Blake hovered uncertainly behind them, his eyes darting toward the brothers and then toward the other passengers who were clearly recording. The fracture in the crew's unity was widening. Then it happened. A sudden cry broke the stalemate. Harold Clara Fitzgerald's voice rang out, high and panicked. The elderly man slumped sideways in his seat, his face pale, hand clutching his chest. Gas filled the cabin. Malcolm Ellis, the quietest of the three, the one who had spent years keeping his EMT certification current for emergencies like this, was out of his seat in seconds. "Move," he barked, his training overriding decorum. He was at Harold's side in moments, kneeling on the carpet, his fingers pressed to the man's wrist. Pulse weak, skin clammy. "Classic cardiac distress," Malcolm muttered, almost to himself. He looked up sharply. "We need the emergency medical kit." Now Kenneth stepped forward, blocking his path. "Sir, sit down. Protocol requires protocol will kill him." Malcolm snapped, eyes blazing. "Get me the kit or get out of the way." Passengers began shouting. "Let him help," Martha Jennings cried. "He knows what he's doing." The businessman across the aisle added. He's EMT certified, let the man work. Julian stood, his voice cutting through the chaos. Documenting obstruction of medical aid. Time 9:47 p.m. Witnesses present. His tablet camera glowed, recording Kenneth's refusal. Damien moved too, his voice sharp as steel. Kenneth, if Harold Fitzgerald dies because you blocked assistance, you won't just lose your job. You'll face charges. Decide right now if your pride is worth a man's life. For a moment, Kenneth froze, torn between arrogance and fear. It was Ethan who broke the deadlock. He darted forward, shoved the emergency kit into Malcolm's hands, and whispered, "Do it." Malcolm tore it open, hands moving fast. Aspirin, oxygen mask. Keep him upright. Clara sobbed, holding her husband's hand as Malcolm worked with precision. The cabin fell silent, except for Malcolm's calm instructions and Harold's labored breaths. Minutes stretched, tense and fragile. Slowly, Harold's breathing steadied, color creeping back into his cheeks. Clara whispered, "Thank you. Thank you," her tears spilling freely. The cabin erupted in murmurs relief, admiration, outrage. Phones caught everything: Kenneth blocking aid, Malcolm saving a life, Ethan breaking ranks to help. Damien leaned back against his seat, exhaling. They just lost every ounce of credibility they had. Adrian nodded slowly. And they don't even realize the story has already left this plane. Claire's face was ghostly pale now. Kenneth stood rigid, his fists clenched, as if sheer denial could erase what had just unfolded. Ethan avoided their eyes, focusing instead on steadying Harold's oxygen mask. The intercom chimed again. Captain Harlow's voice sounded strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed of a medical emergency. Paramedics will meet us at landing. Please remain calm and seated." Julian looked at his brothers, his eyes clear and sharp. No mention of Malcolm's intervention, no mention of crew obstruction, just a medical emergency. They're already trying to rewrite the narrative. Damien smirked, tapping his phone screen to show the recording count climbing. Let them try. Every passenger here knows the truth, and half the country will know it by the time we touch down. The Ellis brothers sat together in silence for a moment, the weight of what had just transpired heavy on their shoulders. The storm had broken open. What began as withheld meals had now escalated into a battle over truth, survival, and dignity at 35,000 feet. And as the plane hurtled westward through the night sky, the brothers knew the landing would not be the end. It would be the reckoning. The cabin lights dimmed as the aircraft began its slow descent toward San Francisco. The night sky beyond the windows glittered with scattered stars. But inside the cabin, the air was thick with unease. Everyone had just witnessed a life nearly lost, and a truth too powerful to ignore. Yet the tension had not broken, it had only sharpened. Malcolm remained by Harold Fitzgerald's side, his steady hands checking pulse and breathing, the oxygen mask secured. Clara clutched her husband's hand, her trembling finally slowing into deep, shaky breaths. "You saved him," she whispered to Malcolm, her gratitude overflowing. Malcolm offered a small nod, his eyes kind. He saved himself by holding on. "I just gave him a chance." Passengers nearby leaned in closer, some murmuring encouragement, others offering bottled water to Clara. The businessman across the aisle shook his head in disbelief. Unbelievable. They nearly let that man die to keep their pride intact. This is bigger than discrimination. It's negligence. Adrian sat quietly, watching the crew. Claire and Kenneth had retreated into the galley, whispering furiously, while Ethan moved back and forth, assisting Malcolm and quietly offering comfort to passengers unsettled by the ordeal. The divide within the crew was stark one side, clinging to denial and self-preservation, the other inching toward truth. Damien leaned back, arms folded, his eyes tracking every movement. "They're scrambling," he murmured to Julian, trying to figure out how to spin this. But every camera in this cabin caught them blocking Malcolm. Julian nodded, his stylus flying across his tablet. And every witness has already formed their judgment. Evidence plus perception. Together, it's a storm they can't contain. He paused, then added, "But watch, they'll try anyway." Denial is their instinct. As if on cue, the intercom crackled. Captain Harlow's voice, clipped and sterile, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we approach San Francisco International, we remind you to remain seated until the seatbelt sign is switched off. We are aware of the earlier medical situation and thank our crew for their swift response. Paramedics will meet us upon arrival." A ripple of outrage spread through the passengers. Martha Jennings sat up straighter, her voice carrying across the cabin. "That's not what happened, and you know it. That man wouldn't be alive if it weren't for Malcolm Ellis." Others nodded in agreement, their voices rising. "We saw it." Someone shouted from row 5. The crew tried to stop him. Phones lifted higher now, openly recording. The captain's attempt to redirect the narrative had backfired. Passengers were no longer passive. They were participants in the story. Adrian leaned toward his brothers, his voice quiet but heavy with resolve. "The descent is no longer about landing a plane. It's about landing the truth." Claire reappeared, her face pale but determined. She raised her hands in an attempt to calm the murmuring crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, we ask for cooperation. We'll file a full report. Misunderstandings happen in the heat of emergency situations. Let's not jump to conclusions." Damien couldn't resist. His laugh cut through the silence, sharp and bitter. "Misunderstandings, I guess, blocking medical aid, denying meals, and threatening diversion is just a big misunderstanding now," Julian added, his tone cold but precise. "Misunderstandings don't explain 17 prior complaints against Heather Barrett or 30 against Kenneth Doyle. This is a pattern. Claire, and patterns don't lie." Claire froze, her lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes darted toward Ethan, who stood silently near the beverage cart. When she caught his gaze, she found no support. Ethan's face was unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. A chime signaled the final descent. The plane tilted gently, city lights glittering like scattered jewels below. Passengers adjusted their belts, but their eyes never left the brothers. The anticipation was electric. Everyone knew a reckoning awaited at the gate. Adrian glanced at his watch, then at his brothers. "Executive team is already on the ground," he said softly. "They'll be waiting when we step off this plane, and every decision made up here will meet daylight down there." Damien smirked, though his voice carried a harder edge. "Daylight's coming fast, and they've got nowhere to hide." Julian closed his tablet, the glow fading. He looked toward Harold, who now breathed more steadily, and toward Clara, who had her eyes fixed on the brothers with gratitude and fierce determination. "This isn't just about us anymore," Julian said quietly. "It's about them. Every passenger who's been silenced, every story buried." The wheels thudded against the runway, the sudden jolt rattling through the cabin. A collective exhale rippled through the passengers, but relief didn't follow. The real turbulence was still to come. As the plane taxied, Claire whispered urgently to Kenneth near the galley. "We need to get ahead of this." "If they really are the Ellis brothers," Kenneth cut her off, his face a mask of denial. "They're bluffing. Owners wouldn't stoop to this. They're nobodies with business cards." Ethan finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You're wrong. They're not bluffing. I recognize them. Everyone here knows it now. Stop lying to yourself." Kenneth's glare could have burned holes, but Ethan didn't flinch. For the first time, he looked more like a man choosing sides than a boy caught in the middle. The aircraft slowed, turning toward the gate. Outside, flashing lights revealed paramedics waiting, their gurney prepared. Clara whispered another tearful thank you to Malcolm as the medics prepared to board. The moment was raw, human, and undeniable. The captain's voice returned, his tone heavy. "Crew, remain on board after passenger deplaning. Operational debriefing required." The words sent shockwaves through the crew. Claire's hands tightened around her notepad. Kenneth's jaw set like stone. Ethan lowered his eyes but felt a flicker of relief. The tide had shifted. Adrian rose slowly, his brothers following. The entire cabin turned to watch them, every eye fixed as if history itself walked down the aisle. Adrian's voice was calm but resonant, carrying through the hush. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience tonight. The truth of what you witness matters. If you choose to share it, you'll be part of ensuring no passenger ever endures this again." Applause broke out, not thunderous, but steady, defiant. Passengers clapped with conviction, the sound echoing in the small cabin. Martha Jennings' hands trembled as she clapped, tears shining in her eyes. The businessman across the aisle added his voice, strong and unwavering. The Ellis brothers stood united, their presence both steady and unyielding. The descent was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The jet bridge rattled against the aircraft door with a hollow thud. A hiss of released air filled the cabin as the locks disengaged. The usual shuffle of passengers eager to disembark was absent. Instead, the cabin buzzed with an uneasy anticipation. People sat straighter, phones still in hand, waiting for what would happen next. Adrian Ellis rose first, his posture calm yet commanding. Damien followed, with his trademark fire simmering just beneath the surface, while Julian tucked his tablet under his arm, every recorded note preserved and ready. Malcolm remained near Harold Fitzgerald until the paramedics boarded, briefing them with professional precision before finally stepping aside. Clara clutched Malcolm's hand one last time, whispering her gratitude with tears still streaming. As the brothers moved toward the front, passengers began clapping softly again, not the polite applause of landing, but a gesture of solidarity. It grew louder, row by row, until the cabin rang with support. The businessman across the aisle rose halfway from his seat, his voice strong. "We saw it all. We'll stand with you." Martha Jennings, frail but fierce, added, "Don't let them silence this. We've seen too much already." The brothers paused, nodding in acknowledgement. Adrian's calm smile carried both gratitude and reassurance. "Your voices matter," he said softly, though it carried far. "Don't let them be erased." At the door, Claire Monroe and Kenneth Doyle stood stiff, blocking the exit with forced authority. Claire's face was pale, her knuckles white around her notepad. Kenneth's glare was hard, his stance squared, as though sheer physical presence could reassert dominance. Ethan Blake lingered behind them, his eyes flicking nervously between crew and passengers. "Gentlemen," Kenneth began, his voice firm but strained, "we'll need you to remain on board for questioning. Airline policy requires—" Damien's laugh was low and sharp. "Policy. That's rich coming from the man who nearly let Harold Fitzgerald die in front of us all. Julian lifted his tablet slightly. Documented, time-stamped, recorded. Every action you took or refused to take has been preserved. Adrian stepped closer, his calm tone slicing sharper than any raised voice. We will disembark with the rest of the passengers. Any questioning will take place with legal counsel present and with our executive team already waiting at the gate. You've lost the privilege of secrecy for the first time. Kenneth faltered, his eyes darting toward Claire. She swallowed hard, glancing back at Ethan, but he remained silent, refusing to shield them. Then, from the jet bridge, a new voice cut through the tension. Step aside. It was Marcus Green, Chief Operating Officer of Sky America, flanked by 2 senior executives and airport security officers. His tailored suit was immaculate, but his expression was grim, carved with the weight of authority. Behind him stood Robert Lane, head of customer operations, his clipboard in hand, his demeanor no nonsense. Claire's face drained of color. Kenneth stiffened, his chest puffing up as if he still held ground. Marcus, I was just enforcing protocol. Protocol doesn't include obstructing medical aid or discriminating against passengers in first class, Marcus interrupted, his voice cold steel. We've received live reports from this flight. Passengers have been broadcasting the truth for the past 2 hours. Do you think we're blind? The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Phones lifted again, capturing the confrontation. Adrian stood silently, his brothers flanking him like an unspoken wall of unity. He didn't need to speak. Marcus Green had taken the baton. Robert Lane stepped forward, his tone clipped and precise, effective immediately. Kenneth Doyle and Claire Monroe are relieved of duty. You will be escorted off this aircraft for investigation. Ethan Blake, you will remain as witness for debriefing. Captain Harlow has been grounded pending review. Claire gasped. You can't just... We just did, Marcus snapped, his voice hard as granite. He turned to Adrian. Mr. Ellis, my deepest apologies. This should never have happened. Sky America will take full accountability. Adrian inclined his head slightly, his voice calm, almost gentle. Apologies mean little without reform. Tonight isn't just about us, it's about every passenger who's been silenced, dismissed, or mistreated without power to fight back. Damien's eyes burned as he added, This airline has built its culture on a fragile script of smiles that cracks the second bias walks in. If you want to make this right, start by tearing up that script. Julian's tone was precise, analytical. Systemic failures require systemic solutions. You'll need new reporting mechanisms, bias training, accountability structures, and not performative functional. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, but Marcus Green's nod was decisive. Understood. We'll convene a full board session within 24 hours. The 3 of you will be central to those reforms. Passengers began clapping again, louder this time, the sound echoing down the cabin. Martha Jennings raised her shaky hand, pointing at the brothers. Don't let them bury this. You 3 are the reason justice will happen. As security moved to escort Claire and Kenneth, the crowd parted, but not silently. Whispers followed them, words like disgrace and racism, each syllable a nail in the coffin of denial. Kenneth's jaw tightened, but his eyes betrayed the first cracks of fear. Claire's shoulders hunched, her notepad clutched uselessly against her chest. Ethan lingered, his face pale, but when Adrian caught his eye, he gave the smallest nod of recognition, as if to say, I chose truth. Adrian returned it with quiet affirmation before leading his brothers down the jet bridge. The air outside was cooler, fresher, charged with the weight of transition. Dozens of flashing cameras and murmuring reporters lined the gate area, tipped off by viral posts already trending nationwide. Hashtags flickered across screens. Meme flying while black. Meme Ellis triplets. Deemed justice at 35K feet. The storm had already begun. As they stepped into the glare of questions and cameras, Adrian whispered just loud enough for his brothers to hear, "This isn't the end. It's the beginning." Damien smirked, straightening his jacket. "Then let's make it count." Julian's eyes scanned the reporters, already framing the next battle. Every system leaves traces. Tonight, we hold them accountable. And as the cameras flashed, capturing the moment of reckoning, the Ellis brothers walked forward not just as passengers denied a meal, but as leaders carrying the weight of justice into the spotlight. The moment Adrian, Damien, Julian, and Malcolm stepped into the terminal, the low hum of airport chatter fractured into chaos. Flashes burst from cameras. Reporters pressed forward, their voices colliding into a storm of questions. "Mr. Ellis, did the crew target you because of race? Is it true one of you saved a passenger's life mid-flight? Are you calling for resignations at Sky America?" The Ellis brothers didn't rush. They moved as one, shoulders squared, calm radiating from their presence. Adrian lifted a hand, not to silence, but to steady the moment. His tone was calm, deliberate, carrying above the din without force. "We'll speak, but not as spectacle, not as gossip, as truth. Give us one moment to organize." Reporters fell back slightly, sensing the difference between a soundbite and something larger. Passengers from the flight filtered into the terminal behind them, their voices adding to the rising chorus. Martha Jennings leaned on her cane, her eyes fierce as she told anyone who would listen. "Don't believe the crew's lies. I was there. I saw everything." The Ellis brothers told the truth. The businessman across the aisle stood tall, adding, "They were discriminated against, and they still saved lives." That's leadership. The validation gave the moment weight beyond headlines. It wasn't just the brothers' voices. It was the passengers, the witnesses, ordinary people whose experiences would prove undeniable. Damien adjusted his tie, his jaw tight. "They'll twist this if we don't get ahead of it. Every minute matters." Julian scanned the crowd, noting the angles of cameras, the live feeds already streaming. We control the narrative by anchoring it in facts. Emotion plus evidence. People will remember both. Malcolm remained slightly behind, his EMT training still sharp and his body language calm, vigilant, his eyes sweeping the crowd like he was monitoring vital signs. Clara Fitzgerald approached him quickly, tears of relief on her face. She gripped his hands tightly. "Harold's stable. The paramedics say he'll make it. You gave me my husband back." Her words were raw, carrying into the microphones around them. Malcolm squeezed her hands gently. He fought hard. "All I did was give him the tools. Don't thank me. Thank him for holding on." But the reporters had latched onto the soundbite already. "Malcolm Ellis saves passenger," mid-flight blared one voice. Another added, "Is this the proof Sky America has systemic bias? Owners discriminated on their own airline." Adrian finally stepped to the microphones that had been thrust forward. His voice was even, but every syllable carried gravity. "Tonight, my brothers and I flew as passengers, not as owners. We didn't announce who we were. We wanted to see this airline through the eyes of ordinary travelers. What we experienced was not just poor service. It was targeted, deliberate discrimination. We were denied meals. We were singled out, threatened with diversion, and when a passenger's life was at stake, A crew member tried to block life-saving aid. That is the truth. Many here witnessed it. Many recorded it. The story is no longer ours alone. It belongs to everyone who was on that flight. Cameras flashed wildly. Passengers shouted their agreement. Martha Jennings waved her arm from the side. He's telling the truth. Every word of it. Damien leaned in slightly, his voice sharper, cutting through the noise. This isn't about 3 CEOs with power. This is about every person who's ever been told they don't belong where they've rightfully earned a seat. If it can happen to us, it can happen to anyone. Julian followed, his tone analytical but laced with quiet passion. Systemic bias doesn't live in one crew or one flight. It thrives in silence, in unchecked complaints, in cover-ups that call discrimination misunderstandings. We're here to make sure the silence ends tonight. The terminal vibrated with energy. Hashtags scrolled in real time across streaming banners as news outlets picked up the feed. Ellis Brothers. Flying while black. Justice in the air. Marcus Green stepped forward, flanked by Robert Lane. His expression was tight, as though balancing corporate survival with personal conscience. He leaned toward Adrian. We need to move this to a private briefing. The board will convene in an hour. This scene is volatile. Adrian's eyes locked on him. Volatile because truth has been caged too long. These voices matter. Marcus, don't shut them out. Marcus hesitated. He looked at the sea of passengers now rallying behind the brothers, their voices rising with demands. Accountability reform. No more silence. For the first time, he realized this was no longer about protecting a brand. It was about preserving legitimacy. Security escorted Claire and Kenneth through a side corridor. Boos erupted. Some passengers shouted. Shame others raised phones to capture their faces, their downfall already trending online. Claire looked stricken, her composure shattered. Kenneth's glare remained hard, but his eyes betrayed cracks of fear as chants of accountability now followed him. Ethan Blake lingered in the crowd, his expression conflicted but resolute. When a reporter thrust a microphone toward him, asking, "Were the Ellis brothers treated unfairly?" Ethan paused, then said quietly but firmly, "Yes, they were." His voice was soft, but it carried like a strike of lightning. Adrian turned back to the cameras, his voice steady. "This is not the end of Sky America. It's the beginning of something new. We will demand transparency. We will build systems that cannot be bent by bias. And we will ensure that dignity and fairness are not privileges, but rights for every passenger, every employee, every voice." The crowd erupted in applause. Clara Fitzgerald clapped through her tears. Martha Jennings raised her cane like a banner. The businessman across the aisle pumped his fist. The Ellis brothers stood tall, framed in the camera flashes, not just as CEOs, but as men carrying a larger truth. The press gauntlet had been brutal, but they had turned it into something more powerful, a stage for justice, a call that millions would hear before the night was over. The glass walls of the Sky America headquarters gleamed under the midnight floodlights, reflecting the chaos of a media storm brewing outside. Dozens of reporters had camped out on the front steps, their cameras trained on the revolving doors. Inside, security ushered the Ellis brothers into the executive floor where the board had been hastily convened. The conference room was cavernous, with a polished oak table stretching nearly the length of the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the San Francisco skyline. At one end sat Marcus Green, composed but visibly strained. Robert Lane stood beside him with a clipboard, his expression tight and businesslike. Around the table, board members whispered in low tones. their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Adrian led his brothers inside with the same calm authority he had carried from the aircraft. Damien followed close, his fire unmistakable even in silence. Julian clutched his tablet, his digital notes and recordings glowing like an arsenal. Malcolm walked with measured steps, his presence quiet but weighted by what he had done in the sky. Marcus rose, his voice strained with the weight of corporate damage control. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming on such short notice. This situation has escalated faster than any of us anticipated. The media is calling it the Ellis incident. Stock futures are already showing a dip. We need to discuss next steps," Damien scoffed, sliding into his chair. "Next steps. How about we start with accountability? Claire Monroe and Kenneth Doyle nearly cost a man his life and tried to weaponize policy against us. That's not a PR crisis. Marcus, that's a systemic failure." Julian leaned forward, his voice clinical. "We've documented 17 prior complaints against Barrett and 30 against Doyle. Complaints that were dismissed, buried, or mislabeled as passenger misconduct. This is not two bad actors, it's a cultural rot in operations and compliance. Until that's acknowledged, any next step is theater." Board members shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, while your concerns are noted, it's important to remember that public outrage tends to be short-lived. If we manage this carefully," Adrian cut in, his tone calm but firm. "You're wrong. Outrage may fade, but trust doesn't return once it's broken. If passengers believe this airline tolerates bias, no crisis team in the world will save you. Reform is not optional, it's survival." Marcus nodded grimly. "Adrian's right. This isn't a storm we can wait out. We've seen the live streams. We've read the hashtags. People aren't just angry. They're inspired. They see the Ellis brothers standing up against injustice on their own airline. If we don't act decisively, Sky America collapses." Damien's eyes burned as he leaned back in his chair. "Then act decisively. Fire every crew member who obstructed, lied, or discriminated. Suspend Captain Harlow. And while you're at it, tear down the wall of silence that's buried complaints for years." Julian slid his tablet across the table. On its screen, complaint logs scrolled endlessly, passengers describing mistreatment, bias, humiliation, all dismissed with generic stamps resolved. "No further action. Inconclusive," he said quietly. "This is your real liability. Tonight just exposed it." The room fell silent. Board members read with grim faces. Marcus rubbed his temple, then looked at the brothers. "What would you have us do?" Adrian's eyes swept the table, his calm voice cutting through the silence. "Begin with transparency. Launch an independent audit of every complaint over the last 10 years. Establish a passenger rights council, led by voices outside this boardroom, with the authority to act. Institute mandatory bias and de-escalation training across every crew, every level, and above all, make accountability visible. Don't just promise change. Show it. In every gate, every cabin, every meal served." Malcolm, who had been silent, finally spoke, his tone soft but heavy with the weight of lived truth. "And remember Harold Fitzgerald. Tonight wasn't abstract. He nearly died because pride mattered more to a crew member than a human life. Don't ever let that happen again." The weight of his words settled like stone. Robert Lane scribbled furiously on his clipboard, his no-nonsense demeanor unchanged, but his tone softer when he spoke. "We can implement those measures. It will mean restructuring. Yes. But the alternative is collapse." One board member, gray-haired and skeptical, finally broke the silence. And what of public perception? What do we say tomorrow when the headlines scream negligence and racism? Adrian met his gaze steadily. You don't fight the headlines. You write a new one. You say we failed. We're accountable. And here's what we're doing to make sure it never happens again. That's how you rebuild trust. Honesty, not spin. The silence that followed was broken not by the board, but by the distant sound of chanting outside the building. Through the glass walls, the muffled cries of protesters filtered in. Justice, in the air, flying while black must end. The voices were growing louder, carrying through the night like a tidal wave. Damien smirked faintly, gesturing toward the window. You hear that? That's not going away. You've got one chance to stand with them or be swept aside by them. Marcus exhaled slowly, then stood. Then it's decided. Effective immediately. Claire Monroe and Kenneth Doyle are terminated. Captain Harlow is suspended pending investigation. An independent audit will begin tomorrow morning. A public statement will go out before sunrise. He looked directly at the Ellis brothers. And we'd like you to help shape the reforms. Adrian's voice softened, though his resolve did not. We'll help, but only if this isn't lip service. Real change. Marcus, not slogans, Julian added, and measurable. We'll design systems with oversight that no one can bury. Malcolm nodded once. If you want this airline to have a future, remember, Harold, remember the passengers who clapped, who recorded, who refused to look away. They're your real boardroom now. The boardroom fell quiet again, not with resistance this time, but with reluctant acceptance. Everyone in the room knew the Ellis brothers were right. The truth could no longer be hidden, and the only way forward was to embrace it. Damien leaned forward, his eyes fierce but his voice steady. Tonight, Sky America stopped being just an airline. It became a symbol, and symbols carry weight. Don't forget that. Outside, the chants grew louder, surging like waves against glass. Inside, the Ellis brothers sat united, their presence both unyielding and necessary. The board had made its choice, but the true test was only beginning. The night had slipped into early morning by the time the Ellis brothers left the boardroom. The city lights of San Francisco shimmered like restless stars, and the hum of chanting still carried from outside the building. Protesters hadn't left. Their voices had grown stronger, amplified by live streams and the momentum of truth that refused to be silenced. Inside the lobby, airport security tried to hold back the crowd of reporters who had camped overnight. Cameras flashed as the brothers descended the marble staircase, their presence commanding but not arrogant. They were not stepping into a press ambush. They were stepping into history. Adrian stopped at the podium that had been hastily assembled near the front doors. He looked at his brothers briefly. They gave the faintest nods. Then, with a calm strength that had anchored every moment since takeoff, he spoke. We met tonight with the board of Sky America. We confronted the failures, the silence, the buried complaints, and this morning, change begins. The room hushed, the scribbling of pens and the tapping of keyboards filling the silence as he continued. Effective immediately. The crew members responsible for discrimination and obstruction have been terminated. The captain has been suspended. But this is not just about a few individuals. This is about a system that allowed silence to replace justice. That system ends today. Damien stepped forward, his fire unmistakable, his words sharper. For years, passengers, especially passengers of color, have spoken up, only to be dismissed as misunderstandings. That ends now. Every complaint will be audited. Every voice will be heard. If this airline wants to survive, it will survive by embracing accountability, not hiding from it. Julian tapped his tablet once before speaking, his tone precise and analytical. We are instituting new measures effective immediately independent oversight of passenger grievances, mandatory bias and de-escalation training for all crew, and a transparent reporting platform accessible to the public. No more buried logs. No more invisible voices. Data and truth will protect passengers, not cover up mistakes. The reporters shouted questions, their voices clashing. Will this affect ownership structure? Will there be resignations? What does this mean for the future of Sky America? Malcolm finally spoke, his voice quiet but resonant enough to cut through the noise. The future begins with remembering Harold Fitzgerald. He lived because people chose action over pride. That's what this airline must become, an airline that chooses humanity over protocol, dignity over silence, courage over fear. The press surged again with questions, but the brothers did not linger. They had said what needed to be said, and their message would echo far beyond this room. Outside, protesters cheered as the news spread across screens. Sky America launches Ellis reforms. By dawn, major networks had shifted their tone. What began as scandal at 35,000 feet was evolving into brothers turn crisis into reform. Hashtags spread like wildfire. Rose, Ellis reforms. Justice takes flight. New Sky America. Passengers from the flight gave live interviews. Martha Jennings, her cane in hand, declared to a morning host, they told the truth. They stood tall. And because of them, people like me, people who've been ignored, will finally have a voice. The businessman across the aisle appeared on another network, recounting the dinner service, the sandwiches, the attempted cover-up. His words resonated. If billionaires can be treated that way, imagine how ordinary passengers have been treated. This change is overdue. Clara Fitzgerald, exhausted but determined, sat by her husband's hospital bed as she told reporters through tears, "My Harold is alive because Malcolm Ellis refused to sit down. Don't ever forget that humanity saved my husband, not policy." Back inside Sky America headquarters, Marcus Green and Robert Lane worked through the night to draft statements and prepare reform rollouts. Marcus knew the airline's survival depended on following through. For the first time in years, the crisis team wasn't writing empty words. They were implementing real change under the Ellis brothers' guidance. Yet amidst the whirlwind, there was quiet, too. In their private office space above the boardroom, the brothers sat together, the adrenaline finally waning. Damien paced, still restless. You know they'll fight back. Right. Not Claire and Kenneth, they're finished. But the old guard, the ones who built this culture of silence, they'll resist. Julian leaned back in his chair, exhaustion heavy in his eyes, but his mind still sharp. Resistance is inevitable, but every step they take against reform will expose them further. Transparency is our shield now. They can't win in the dark anymore. Adrian poured water into 3 glasses, his movements slow, deliberate. We didn't choose this moment, but it chose us, and we'll carry it through. Not for shareholders, not even for Sky America. For every passenger who's ever felt invisible. Malcolm sat quietly, his hands folded, his thoughts heavy with Harold's pale face as he collapsed mid-flight. Finally, he said softly, saving Harold wasn't just about him. It was about proving that lives matter more than pride, more than rules bent by prejudice. If Sky America forgets that, all the reforms in the world won't save it. For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the hum of the city waking outside. Each brother carried his own weight, but together, their resolve was unshakable. By mid-morning, Sky America's stock had dipped but stabilized as news of the reform spread. Analysts debated whether the company could recover, while activists hailed the Ellis brothers as catalysts for systemic change. Editorials called the incident a turning point in corporate accountability and a rare moment where power chose justice over silence. But for Adrian, Damien, Julian, and Malcolm, the noise of headlines mattered less than the voices of passengers who finally felt seen. Their inboxes filled with messages from flight attendants who admitted they'd witnessed discrimination but had been too afraid to speak, from passengers who shared stories of humiliation buried under misconduct labels, from workers who said the brothers' courage gave them hope. Adrian read one message aloud. "I'm a single mother who was told I didn't belong in first class because I bought my ticket with miles. I complained. Nothing happened. Last night, watching you three, I cried. For the first time. I believe things might change." Damien's fists clenched, but his voice softened. "That's why we fight." Julian nodded. "And why we don't stop," Malcolm added quietly. "Because this isn't just about flying. It's about living with dignity." As the sun climbed higher over San Francisco, painting the glass towers gold, the Ellis brothers stood together at the window. The night had been long, the storm brutal, but the dawn carried something new, not just accountability, but hope. Weeks passed, and what began as a single-flight incident had rippled into something larger than any of the Ellis brothers could have predicted. Sky America, once whispered about for its decline and its whispers of discrimination, was now at the center of a national conversations about equity, accountability, and corporate culture. The morning after their press conference, media coverage was relentless. Yet as the frenzy calmed, the real work began: the slow, often unseen process of turning public promises into sustainable change. Inside Sky America's headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted. Where hushed tones and defensive whispers once filled the hallways, now there was openness, even cautious optimism. Marcus Green spearheaded town halls across every department. He stood alongside the Ellis brothers, answering tough questions, listening to long overdue grievances, and inviting suggestions from staff at every level. Some employees cried as they shared experiences of being silenced under previous management. Others admitted to complicity, confessing they had seen mistreatment but lacked the courage to intervene. The Ellis brothers didn't shame these confessions. They acknowledged them with empathy. Adrian reminded staff at one town hall, "We've all been passengers on planes, and we've all been passengers in systems. Sometimes silence feels easier, but silence doesn't save lives. Speaking up does." That phrase, "silence doesn't save lives," was soon painted on banners in training rooms, printed on new staff manuals, and echoed in the hearts of workers who felt the truth of it. Damien took a more direct approach. He visited training centers where new attendants practiced service drills. He stopped mid-demonstration once, his booming voice cutting through. "It doesn't matter if a passenger looks like they don't belong. If they have a first-class ticket, you treat them as first class. Period. Respect is not conditional." The room had gone quiet, then filled with applause from recruits who saw in him a leader unwilling to water down the message. Julian immersed himself in the technical side, overseeing the design of the new complaint platform. His vision was clear transparency that couldn't be buried under bureaucracy. The platform included real-time visibility, where passengers could track complaints and see resolution timelines. If Amazon can track a package across the globe, he quipped during a tech rollout, then an airline can track fairness for its customers. Malcolm, still carrying the weight of Harold Fitzgerald's pale face during that mid-air emergency, became the quiet moral anchor of the reforms. He visited Harold and Clara regularly. One evening, Sitting at Harold's bedside, he said softly, "You remind me why this matters. Because dignity isn't abstract, it's survival." Harold squeezed his hand, whispering with emotion, "You didn't just save my life. Son, you saved the soul of this airline." National media soon labeled the initiatives the Ellis Reforms, and the phrase stuck. Civil rights organizations applauded the changes, while industry competitors scrambled to announce their own measures, hoping not to appear regressive. Passengers responded too. Letters and emails poured in, not just recounting past discrimination, but thanking the brothers for validating their pain. One message from a former pilot read, "I lost my job for reporting bias 5 years ago. I thought no one would ever listen. But watching you three finally, someone did." Of course, not everyone welcomed the transformation. Former crew members like Claire Monroe and Kenneth Voss appeared on tabloid shows, painting themselves as victims of reverse discrimination. Their interviews were filled with denial, blaming political correctness for their downfall. Yet each time, the public responded with clips of passenger-recorded videos that contradicted their claims. The truth had too many witnesses now to be erased. The hardest resistance came not from ex-employees, but from certain board members who had grown comfortable in silence. They worried about lawsuits, about costs of retraining, about public backlash. In one heated board meeting, an older executive sneered, "You're making this airline about politics, not business." Adrian fixed him with a steady gaze and replied, "Respect is not politics. It's business. Because without respect, there is no business." The silence that followed spoke volumes. Financially, the gamble paid off faster than expected. Within 6 months, Sky America had not only recovered its stock dip, but surged to a 5-year high. Customers booked tickets not just for price or convenience, but because of what the airline now represented. For many, choosing Sky America became an act of solidarity. "I fly them because they fly fair," one passenger said on a national morning show. That sentiment resonated across millions. But beyond numbers and public relations, the deepest change lived in the small, often unnoticed moments. A black single mother boarding first class with her teenage son wasn't asked to step aside while her papers were triple-checked. A Latino businessman received his meal without delay or suspicion. A young Muslim woman in a hijab boarded without security calling an additional screening for no reason. These small acts of dignity, multiplied across thousands of flights, became the new culture. At an employee recognition event months later, Jessica Alvarez, the junior attendant who had dared to defy Claire by serving the Ellis brothers their rightful meal, was promoted to Director of Passenger Experience. Her acceptance speech was simple but heartfelt. That day, "I just wanted to do what was right. I never imagined it would change so much." But maybe that's how change always starts, with one person refusing to look away. The room erupted in applause, not just for her, but for the reminder that courage wasn't always grand. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and stubborn. The Ellis brothers sat in the front row, proud but reflective. After the applause died down, Malcolm whispered to his brothers, "This is bigger than Sky America now." Adrian nodded. "It always was." Damien smiled faintly. "The system was broken, and we fixed a part of it. But there are other systems, other rooms full of silence, waiting." They knew this wasn't the end. Their journey had started in one cabin at 35,000 feet. But injustice wasn't limited to airlines. Hotels, hospitals, schools, workplaces all carried the same patterns. And perhaps, just perhaps, their fight had prepared them for the next chapter. The night closed with employees cheering, Music echoing through the hall, and hope thick in the air. Outside, the city lights of San Francisco flickered like stars over water, reflecting the possibility of a world where dignity was no longer negotiable. The Ellis brothers walked out together, side by side, their silhouettes merging against the glow of streetlights. They carried not just the weight of the night, but the promise of mornings yet to come. And for the first time in a long time, the skies above Sky America felt wide open, not just for them, but for everyone who believed in fairness taking flight. Months melted into a year, and what began as turbulence in a single cabin had reshaped not only Sky America, but also the way an entire industry looked at responsibility. The Ellis reforms, once spoken of cautiously, were now held up as a gold standard. Training modules developed under Julian's direction were studied in universities. Damien's uncompromising speeches about dignity were quoted in HR manuals across sectors. Adrian's calm insistence on transparency was played in leadership seminars. And Malcolm's quiet reminder that human lives were not abstractions echoed in countless boardrooms where decisions once had been made with cold detachment. Sky America had transformed. Its uniforms had been redesigned with input from frontline staff, carrying subtle patterns inspired by diverse cultural motifs. Its meal service, once the spark of injustice, was now a point of pride, with menus sourced through local partnerships that represented the richness of America's communities. Flight attendants underwent immersive training that didn't just teach service, it taught empathy. The result was not perfection, but an airline that passengers trusted, a trust forged in accountability rather than slogans. The change, however, did not stay confined to the airline industry. Advocacy groups began pressing hospitals, universities, and corporations to adopt Ellis protocols. These included independent complaint audits, transparency dashboards, and dignity-centered training. A civil rights lawyer wrote in a major op-ed, "The Ellis brothers proved what many leaders fear when accountability is visible. Silence loses its power. This isn't just about flying. It's about living in a world where fairness is no longer optional." Adrian found himself invited to Capitol Hill hearings, his calm demeanor standing out among political soundbites. Senators asked him whether corporate reform could be legislated. He replied gently but firmly, "You cannot legislate compassion, but you can legislate accountability, and accountability, when practiced openly, creates the space where compassion can finally breathe." His words were replayed on evening news programs, resonating beyond the chamber walls. Damien toured universities and spoke with young entrepreneurs. In one lecture, a student asked if he ever felt exhausted fighting the same battles again and again. Damien's response was fiery but layered with vulnerability. "Exhausted every day. But exhaustion is not defeat. My ancestors were exhausted building futures with fewer tools than I have. If I don't keep going, who am I to claim their legacy?" The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was thunderous, the kind that carries truth into memory. Julian became the architect of a movement larger than Sky America. He designed open-source platforms for transparency, making them available to other industries. Nonprofits adopted his systems for housing complaints. School districts began using them for equity reporting. He smiled quietly when he saw the ripple effects, knowing numbers and systems could wield justice when wielded with integrity. Malcolm, meanwhile, stayed closest to the ground. He spent time with families who had suffered discrimination not on airplanes but in hospitals, schools, and workplaces. Often, he said little. He listened, his presence steady, his empathy unshakable. Clara Fitzgerald once told him, while sitting in her garden, You carry people's pain like it's your own." He nodded softly. "Because it is." Not all moments were triumphant. Backlash brewed from corners resistant to change. Talk shows criticized the brothers as opportunists. Some former executives painted them as disruptors who politicized air travel. Yet each attempt to discredit them only fueled the counter wave of support. For every op-ed against them, there were 3 more letters of gratitude. For every critic on television, there were passengers who stood up and said, "They gave me back my dignity." Sky America itself saw challenges. Not every crew member embraced the reforms easily. Some left, grumbling about overcorrection. Others, however, flourished. Jessica Alvarez thrived as director of passenger experience, her team innovating new service standards that other airlines quickly tried to copy. At her 1-year anniversary speech, she said simply, "I was once just a junior attendant who refused to ignore injustice. Now I lead with the same principle, no one is invisible." The Fitzgeralds remained part of the narrative as well. Harold, who recovered, but frailer, attended a company-wide event alongside Clara. When asked to speak, he said softly, "I am alive because someone refused to accept no for an answer." That moment changed more than my life. It changed a culture. His words brought tears to many eyes, and Adrian later admitted privately that Harold's presence reminded him why they could never stop fighting. The Ellis brothers, though, never sought to be saints. They argued with one another. They questioned whether they were doing enough. At times, the weight of expectation pressed hard against them. One evening, alone, on the rooftop of their office, Adrian confessed to Damien, "What if we fail? What if this all unravels?" Damien, staring at the city lights, replied, "Then we fail fighting for the right thing. And that's still better than winning while silent." Julian once doubted whether his systems would outlast trends. Malcolm reassured him, "They will, because they're not trends. They're truth written in code, and truth has a way of staying." Those moments of doubt, layered with encouragement, revealed their humanity beneath the headlines. A year after the incident, Sky America held a commemorative event. It was not a celebration of scandal, but of survival, of transformation. Employees, passengers, activists, and leaders filled the hangar. A plaque was unveiled near the headquarters entrance. On this day, 3 passengers stood against silence and chose dignity. From their courage, a new sky was born. The plaque bore no names, only the collective truth. The Ellis brothers stood before it quietly. Adrian placed his hand on the metal. Damien nodded with pride. Julian smiled faintly, and Malcolm closed his eyes, as if remembering Harold's breath finally steadying in his hands. Around them, the crowd applauded, not just for them, but for the idea that justice was possible, even in a place as ordinary, as enclosed, as a plane cabin. As the applause faded, Adrian turned to his brothers. "This isn't the end." Damien grinned. "Good. Endings are boring." Julian smirked. "Besides, systems don't fix themselves overnight." Malcolm, with that quiet gravity that always steadied them, said, "Then let's keep building." And so they did. Not just as CEOs, not just as triplets bound by blood, but as men who had carried injustice into the light and refused to set it down. Their story, born from a meal denied, had become a feast of truth shared with the world. And though turbulence still lay ahead in skies, in boardrooms, in lives, they knew their course was true. Because for the Ellis brothers, the sky was no longer just a place to fly. It was a place where justice finally had wings. The story of the Ellis brothers had by now stretched far beyond Sky America. What began in one cabin became a spark that lit conversations in places they never expected. Schools taught lessons on their response, drawing parallels between ethics in leadership and courage under pressure. Civil rights museums curated exhibits titled From Cabin to Culture, showcasing passenger videos, press headlines, and the plaque that marked the airline's new chapter. College students debated the Ellis Standard in classrooms, describing it as a model for how business leaders should balance profit and principle. Adrian watched these ripples with a sense of awe and caution. He knew narratives could be reshaped, softened into myths that stripped away the sharp edges of truth. At one community forum, he reminded the audience, "Don't mistake us for heroes. We were men forced to choose, and we chose justice. The real heroes are those who lived through indignities without a platform, who spoke up when nobody listened. If this story means anything, let it mean you have that same choice. Every day." His words were met with thoughtful silence, then thunderous applause. Damien found himself fielding interviews where journalists wanted dramatic lines about vengeance or victory. He always steered the conversation differently. "People think we won by firing a crew," he said once on a late-night show. "That was accountability. Yes, but victory isn't punishment. Victory is when the next passenger sits in their seat, eats their meal, and never has to question if they belong there. That's victory." The audience rose to their feet, clapping, because they knew his fire burned not from rage, but from a relentless hunger for dignity. Julian's world became one of screens, data sets, and expanding networks. His transparent complaint tracking system had been licensed to other industries, even to government agencies. Critics worried about privacy, but he reassured them with precision. Transparency isn't about exposure. It's about accountability. Data, when used ethically, doesn't shame, it protects. When one housing authority implemented his system, tenants began to see real repairs after years of being ignored. A grandmother wrote to Julian, "My leaky roof got fixed after 3 years. Your system saved my home." He read that letter twice, then saved it in a folder labeled Proof It Works. Malcolm continued to ground them all. He wasn't drawn to cameras or spotlights, but he became a steady presence in communities that had long been bruised by discrimination. He met with young EMTs, teaching them not just skills, but compassion. He visited churches and small gatherings, often sitting quietly before speaking. Once, at a small church in Oakland, he told a group of teenagers, "People will test your worth. They'll try to convince you you're less. Don't waste your life proving them wrong. Live your life proving yourself right." The teens leaned forward, hanging on his every word, because they felt his sincerity in their bones. Sky America itself had become a symbol. Passenger satisfaction soared. Competitors scrambled to copy the reforms, but passengers sensed the difference between imitation and conviction. Activists noted that while other airlines offered surface changes, Sky America's transformation felt lived in, not painted on. And though challenges remained delayed flights, weather cancellations, the unavoidable chaos of air travel passengers responded with more patience, because they believed the company saw them as humans, not seat numbers. Jessica Alvarez thrived in her new role, reshaping passenger experiences from the inside. She introduced dignity audits, where undercover evaluators tested not just service quality, but respect. In a meeting with Adrian, she reported, "We had a crew member who went above and beyond helping a passenger with limited English navigate the cabin. That's not policy, it's heart. That's the culture we want to reward." Adrian smiled, seeing in her the very future they had hoped for, leadership born from courage, not compliance, yet The weight of legacy pressed heavily. Late one evening, Adrian sat with his brothers overlooking the bay. The Golden Gate Bridge glowed in the distance, a reminder of permanence amidst change. "We've started something," he said softly. "But what if it fades when the spotlight shifts? What if it dies when we're no longer here to hold it?" Damien, restless as ever, leaned forward. "Then we keep pushing until it doesn't depend on us, until the culture itself carries it." Julian, ever precise, added, "Systems outlive people. If the systems are strong, the silence can't creep back in." Malcolm, quiet but unshakable, looked at his brothers and said, "And if one person remembers Harold's story, then none of this will ever fade. Because it wasn't about us. It was about life and dignity." Their silence afterward wasn't heavy. It was full, layered with memory and hope. The public saw the Ellis brothers as unshakable, but they knew their vulnerabilities too. Adrian sometimes woke in the middle of the night, replaying the moment Claire dismissed him with cold disdain. Damien clenched his fists, remembering Kenneth's threats. Julian scrolled through old complaint logs, haunted by the names of passengers who had suffered quietly. And Malcolm dreamed often of Harold's labored breaths, his fear mirrored in so many others unseen. Yet these wounds fueled, rather than weakened, them. They reminded each brother that justice was not abstract. It was lived. It was personal. It was necessary. On the anniversary of the flight, Sky America unveiled a new initiative, the Harold Fitzgerald Fellowship. It offered scholarships for young professionals of color pursuing careers in aviation, healthcare, or public service. Clara Fitzgerald spoke at the launch, tears streaming as she said, "My Harold is with me today. But even if he weren't, I would stand here and thank you, because you didn't just save his life. You gave others a chance to build theirs." The applause was long, heartfelt, echoing like the promise of a better tomorrow. As the night drew to a close, the Ellis brothers walked through the terminal, where it had all begun. The same kind of bustling passengers filled the space families rushing, business travelers typing furiously, children tugging on parents' arms. Ordinary life, messy and vibrant, Adrian whispered, almost to himself. "It could have been anyone," Damien answered, his voice low but certain. "That's why it had to be us." Julian nodded. "And that's why it has to keep going." Malcolm, glancing at the faces around them, finished softly, "Because the sky belongs to all of us." They walked forward, blending into the crowd. Not above it, but part of it. Leaders, yes. Survivors of injustice, yes. But more than anything, men who carried a truth that would not be silenced. Not in the skies, not on the ground, not ever again. And so their story, born of indignity, forged into justice, and carried forward by countless others, became less about three men and more about the world they helped shape. A world where silence had less room to grow. A world where dignity was not granted, but expected. The legacy of the Ellis brothers was not a flight, not even an airline. It was a reminder written into the sky itself. Justice, like flight, requires lift, and lift comes when people rise together. The second year after the incident came with challenges that no press headline could capture. The Ellis brothers had become symbols, but symbols carried expectations that often felt heavier than the crisis itself. Everywhere they went, people asked them to speak, to endorse, to fix, to lead. They were asked to be both businessmen and moral anchors, a dual role that left little room for rest. Adrian often bore the brunt of it. He was the calm face in interviews, the steady voice in boardrooms, the one others leaned on when tempers threatened to flare. Late one evening, as he walked through his office. He found himself staring at the plaque commemorating their stand, from silence to dignity. He ran his hand across the metal and whispered, "But what about the silence inside us?" He worried that in chasing justice outwardly, he was neglecting the quieter struggles of his brothers, and even his own. Damien, fiery and relentless, sometimes found his flame difficult to control. He gave speech after speech, pushing audiences to face hard truths. Yet at night he confessed to Malcolm, "I feel like I'm yelling into the wind." Mal. They clap. They cheer. But do they really change Malcolm? Steady as ever, would answer, "You don't see change when it happens. You see it when silence doesn't return. Trust that the noise you make is louder than the quiet they once hid behind." Still, Damien wrestled with restlessness, feeling the distance between rhetoric and reality. Julian carried his own burden, one less visible but just as sharp. His systems were spreading across industries, but with that came scrutiny. A security breach at one municipality's database had journalists questioning his designs, even though it was a local error, not his code. In a rare moment of frustration, he slammed his laptop shut and muttered, "They're waiting for us to fail. They want proof we're not infallible." Adrian placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then show them we're not. Show them we're human." Systems don't need perfection. They need persistence. Julian nodded, but he still felt the sting of expectation. Malcolm remained their compass, but even compasses can tremble. He visited Harold and Clara often, finding solace in their resilience. One afternoon, as Clara poured tea, she asked gently, "Do you boys ever rest?" Malcolm gave a small smile. "Rest feels selfish when the world keeps asking." Clara's reply was soft but firm. "Rest is not selfish. It's preparation. You can't carry the sky if your own legs give out." Her words lingered with him long after he left, a reminder that even anchors needed grounding. Despite the internal struggles, progress marched on. Sky America launched the Harold Fitzgerald Fellowship with its first class of recipients, a diverse group of young students studying aviation, law, and medicine. The brothers attended the opening ceremony. Watching the scholars speak about their dreams reminded them why they had endured sleepless nights. One young woman said, "I want to be a pilot because of what you showed me, that the sky belongs to all of us." Another student, studying law, declared, "I will defend those who are silenced, because you showed me silence can be broken." The room erupted in applause, and for a moment, the brothers felt lighter. Jessica Alvarez continued to innovate, piloting a new program where attendants rotated into leadership training modules. Her vision was clear: create leaders at every level, so injustice could not take root quietly. If every flight attendant feels empowered to act, then no Claire or Kenneth can ever define this airline again, she told the staff. Adrian admired her courage and foresight, seeing in her the future he hoped Sky America would always choose. But not all echoes from the past faded. Kenneth Doyle, bitter and unrepentant, resurfaced in an online forum, claiming he had been scapegoated. His words gained traction in small corners of social media, where resentment brewed among those who disliked the reforms. "They ruined my career to make a political point," he wrote. Yet every time his words spread, passengers reposted the original videos, silencing the denial with evidence. It became clear that while lies could resurface, truth had deeper roots. Claire Monroe disappeared from public view, but whispers of lawsuits circled. Legal challenges came, but none gained traction. The evidence was too strong, the witness accounts too many. Still, The persistence of her name reminded the brothers that progress was never free of shadows. In quiet moments, the brothers gathered together to share doubts, victories, and the ordinary bond of family. One night, sitting around Julian's kitchen table, Malcolm broke the silence. "Do you ever think about that flight? Not just the injustice, but the small things, the way the cabin lights flickered, the hum of the engines." The moment before it all started, the others fell silent, remembering the ordinariness that had birthed something extraordinary. Adrian finally said, "I think about it every day, and I remind myself it was just a meal. But it was never just a meal. It was a mirror, and we couldn't look away." Damien leaned back, his fire softening into reflection. "Funny, isn't it? They tried to deny us dignity, and in the end, they gave us purpose," Julian added quietly. "Purpose we didn't ask for, but purpose we couldn't refuse." Malcolm smiled faintly. "And purpose worth carrying, even when it's heavy." As the night deepened, they sat in silence, not the silence of injustice, but the silence of understanding. They knew their journey wasn't over. There would be more fights, more resistance, more turbulence, but they also knew that together, they had learned to turn turbulence into transformation. When they finally parted ways, the city was quiet. The streets washed in the glow of streetlights. Each brother walked into the night carrying not just his own doubts, but the shared weight of a sky they had promised to keep open for Harold, for Clara, for Jessica, for every passenger who believed that dignity should not depend on skin color, ticket class, or silence. The legacy was still being written. And though they felt the weight of the sky, they also felt its vastness, its promise, because as Malcolm had said so many times, the sky belonged to everyone, and they would not rest until everyone believed it. The third year after the incident dawned not with headlines, but with quieter shifts, those subtle signs that culture had changed. Families boarded Sky America flights with less fear in their eyes. Business travelers of color spoke in interviews about feeling finally treated as equals. Flight attendants began sharing stories of choosing dignity even when supervisors weren't watching. And across the country, other industries pointed to Sky America as proof that systemic reform was possible if leaders dared to commit. Adrian traveled often during this period, not as a CEO meeting investors, but as a listener. He sat with flight crews in break rooms, leaning against metal counters while they vented frustrations. A young black attendant told him, voice shaking, "I used to hide my accent because I thought passengers wouldn't respect me. Now I feel like I can be myself." Adrian placed a hand over his heart and replied, "That's the measure of reform, not just rules, but freedom to breathe as who you are." Those moments reminded him why their work mattered more than any quarterly report. Damien continued to ignite rooms with his fire, but he also began tempering his speeches with more stories of healing than anger. At one town hall in Atlanta, he shared a memory he rarely voiced. "I was 9 years old the first time someone told me I didn't belong in a space my family had earned. That wound never really healed until that night on the plane. Because for the first time, I saw silence break in real time. And I realized something. Justice isn't about erasing wounds. It's about showing scars so others know they're not alone." The crowd rose, not in thunderous applause, but in a slow, standing ovation, the kind that meant people were moved to their core. Julian found himself at the center of technological debates. His systems, now adopted in schools, hospitals, and government agencies, sparked conversations about ethics. Critics argued about data overreach, while communities praised the newfound visibility of complaints long ignored. Julian navigated these waters with his characteristic precision. In one televised debate, he said simply, "Transparency isn't surveillance, it's trust. And trust is the only currency that sustains democracy." The line trended for days, clipped and shared as both a rallying cry and a challenge to institutions beyond airlines. Malcolm, as always, remained closest to the ground. He returned again and again to the Fitzgeralds' home, sharing meals with Harold and Claire as though they were extended family. Harold, though frailer, still had a spark in his eye. Over coffee one afternoon, he told Malcolm, "The day you saved me, you saved more than a life. You saved my faith that this world can be better." Malcolm squeezed his shoulder and whispered, "You gave us a reason to keep fighting." Their bond had become more than symbolic. It was personal, rooted in shared survival. Jessica Alvarez thrived in her leadership role, shaping policies that rippled outward. She spearheaded a mentorship program pairing new attendants with experienced ones who embodied the new culture of dignity. "You don't train respect once," she told her team. "You plant it, water it, and protect it until it becomes the air we breathe." Under her guidance, crew satisfaction soared, and even skeptics began to soften. She became not just a reformer, but a symbol of what courage could achieve when given space to grow. Still, the journey was not without turbulence. Lawsuits from former employees dragged through the courts, occasionally splashing headlines across tabloids. Kenneth Doyle's bitter online rants resurfaced every few months, though fewer people paid attention now. Claire Monroe's legal appeals failed repeatedly, but each attempt forced the brothers to relive painful details. At times, they felt the sting of exhaustion. At times, they questioned whether change could ever be complete. One evening, the brothers gathered at Adrian's home overlooking the bay. They sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the water in shades of gold. Silence hung between them until Julian spoke. "Do you ever wonder if this is all temporary? If one day, another crew somewhere will repeat the same mistakes, and we'll be back where we started?" Damien clenched his jaw. "Of course they will. Prejudice doesn't vanish. It waits. But the difference now is this: when it shows itself, people won't be alone. They'll have systems, allies, truth on their side." Adrian nodded thoughtfully. "And maybe that's all we can give a world where injustice doesn't go unanswered." Malcolm, his gaze steady on the horizon, added softly, "And a reminder that even scars can become maps. People will find their way forward if they see where we've been." Their words settled into the night like stones in water, creating ripples that seemed to stretch far beyond the porch, far beyond the bay. Into the future they were shaping one decision at a time. Months later, they were invited to speak at an international summit on corporate responsibility in Geneva. Leaders from around the world gathered, eager to learn how an airline once on the brink had become a model for reform. Adrian spoke first, measured and calm. "Change begins not with power, but with humility, the humility to admit failure and the courage to rebuild." Damien followed, his fire directed not at enemies, but at inertia. "If you think silence is cheaper than justice, remember this silence always costs more in the end." Julian then explained the technical blueprint, showing how systems could guard against bias. Finally, Malcolm ended their session with words that stilled the grand hall. "Don't forget the people. Don't forget Harold. Change is not numbers or policies. It's the difference between life and death, dignity and despair. Never lose sight of that." The hall erupted in applause, but more importantly, in resolve. Delegates left with more than notes. They left with conviction. On their flight home, the brothers sat together in quiet reflection. The cabin was calm, attendants moving with warmth and professionalism. A passenger nearby leaned over, recognizing them. "You're the Ellis brothers, aren't you? I just want to say thank you. Flying feels different now." Adrian smiled kindly. Damien nodded. Julian tapped his tablet with a faint grin. And Malcolm simply said, "That means everything." As the plane soared above the clouds, the brothers gazed out the window. The sky stretched endlessly before them, a reminder of both the battles behind and the challenges ahead. They knew their story was not a fairy tale with a neat ending, but it was proof that when silence is broken, dignity can take flight. And somewhere between earth and sky, they found peace not in perfection, but in persistence. The journey would continue, but for now, they rested, knowing they had shifted the course of more than just an airline. They had shifted the course of lives, of culture, of what it meant to belong. The sky, at last, felt like it belonged to everyone. The story of the Ellis brothers reminds us of something many of us have felt in silence: the sting of being dismissed, overlooked, or treated as less than human. Their journey shows that dignity is not a privilege, it is a right, one that should never depend on status, wealth, or background. Yet discrimination often hides in plain sight, disguised as procedure or miscommunication. For older generations especially, this tale strikes a deep chord. Many remember times when speaking up meant risking everything, when unfair treatment was accepted as the cost of survival. The brothers chose differently. They documented the truth, held their ground with calm strength, and used their power not for revenge, but for systemic change. The lesson for us is clear silence may feel safer, but silence allows injustice to grow. Change begins when someone dares to say, "This is not acceptable." And lasting change comes when we transform pain into systems that protect others. In our own lives, whether in families, workplaces, or communities, we have the same choice. We can let small wrongs pass, or we can confront them with dignity and courage, leaving a path of hope for those who come after us. Thank you for being with us through this story. If it touched you, if it reminded you of something you've lived through, or someone you love, please don't let it stop here. Your voice matters. Together, we can spread stories that challenge injustice and inspire change. So take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of resilience, dignity, and transformation. Your support helps keep these voices alive. From our hearts to yours, thank you for watching.